Okay.
Thanks, Lori.
Welcome.
This is kind of a PowerPoint that I put together, and I hope it'll work okay. I was rushing through it this afternoon, and this is I'm going to talk about Harry Truman and about how I believe God worked in his life and what he did. He really was our first president that was a blessing to Israel. Truman said this, and I think it's very appropriate for these days. He said, "No government is perfect. One of the chief virtues of a democracy, however, is that its defects are always visible, yeah, and under democratic processes can be pointed out and corrected." Um, I think there's no doubt, and I'm sure that most of you agree, the battle we are in is truly a spiritual battle. That's all of life is a spiritual battle. And if we just want to focus in on politics, definitely this year has been one of the most spiritual battles I think our nation has ever been in. Not only that, it's bigger than that. It's a battle against demonic forces and a demonic battle to diminish and deny God's covenant promises. And of course, the one I'm most interested in and the one we'll focus on is God's covenant promises to the Jewish people and to the land of Israel. Does God intervene in elections? I think we all have questions about that. And up until yesterday, people were telling me how they're praying and they know how it's going to turn out. And actually, I shut the news off yesterday morning, so I'm a little behind. And I've been such a news fanatic. And this has been something I just had to do because, well, you can figure that out. How do we get out of this mess? Well, I want to look at the life of Harry Truman and see how some of these things came about. Truman was the first of three children born to John Anderson Truman, a farmer and a mule trader, and his wife, Martha Ellen Truman. Actually, Harry's father was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He would trade horses and he'd do very well, and then he'd take that money and he'd put it into buying wheat futures and things like that, and then he'd lose all of it. And he kind of had a background where they didn't really prosper in the long run. And when Truman was president, some reporter said something to him about well, your father probably wasn't very successful, or I can't remember the exact words. And Truman just blew up at him. He said, "Yeah, maybe you think my father wasn't very successful, but you better give him credit. His son became president of the United States." And I was delighted by Truman's response to that. Anyway, one of the questions was about Harry Truman's middle name. And the parents couldn't make up on what they were going to name him. They knew it was going to be the letter S because his grandfather was Solomon Young, and the grandfather on the other side was Anderson Ship Truman. So they finally decided we'll just put the letter S there. And this is of no great significance, but I looked at a bunch of Harry Truman's signatures, even as president. And one of them is just Harry Truman. It's the Harry S. Truman at the bottom. And he didn't, in those years, he didn't put a period after the S. And then some English teacher got on his case and said, this is very bad grammatical stuff not to put a dot there for S. And Truman kind of bent to that. And then this autograph of his above it is Harry S. period Truman. And then after a while, that was just, I think, slowed it down too much to write his name. So he just wrote Harry, and there was something in there that looked like an S, and right into Truman. So I'm sure sometime when you're on a quiz program, they're going to ask you what his name is, and you're going to have information there that nobody really cares about. Anyway, Harry was born in this very small house. It was, in some ways, it was probably a two-room house in Lamar, Missouri in 1884. And I'm going to skip some pictures here and move on to this one. He grew up after that. His father went to this farm up on the right hand corner, which is the house still stands there. But actually, today, most of the suburbs have moved around it. But this was a very big farm when Truman was young, a child, and his the name of it was Grandview. And it was a Grandview. Today, if you like looking at suburbs, that's what you can see. But the house still stands there, and I love this. This is a house before it's been painted, although the last time I was there, it looks kind of shabby. Um, uh, so he spent the first years of his life on that farm. His father was working for his wife's father on the farm. They realized that Harry was a very precocious child, but because his eyesight was bad, he had to wear pretty thick glasses. And so he wasn't allowed to go out and roughhouse and everything else, because if he broke the glasses, it was a very expensive item. So what happened was Harry became very involved in reading. Even as a very young child, he was reading, and then also music. And his mother was teaching him piano. These were not the things in the 1880s that boys were supposed to be doing. So he was a little different. And finally, his mother insisted that they leave the farm and they move into Independence, Missouri. And when they moved into Independence, I don't know if they bought a house or if they rented the house, but the wonderful thing about it was they moved into right next door to an Orthodox Jewish family. And little Harry, at 5 and 6 years old, I've read the eldest daughter in that family. She wrote all of these things about remembering Harry Truman as a young child. Harry was in and out of their house all the time. Now, I kind of know, in some ways, I grew up in a pretty anti-Semitic kind of a family in an area. And if we'd had Orthodox Jews living near us, people in the family would have said, "Oh, don't go over there. Smell that food. Isn't that, these are Jews," and all that stuff. Praise God that Harry's family never did that. And they said, little Harry was in our house all the time. And his best friend was the young boy there named Abe. And the eldest daughter in that family said, Harry was really our Shabbos Goy. And if you know a Shabbos Goy, it's Yiddish for on the Sabbath. It's a Gentile who will come into an Orthodox Jewish house and will do things that the Jews can't do, like lighting a gas stove or lighting lamps, things like that. And I didn't know this, but I remember my dad telling me that that's what he did when he was a young boy. And it just kind of went over my head. And it wasn't until later that they used this term for Harry Truman that I said, oh my goodness, that's what my dad was saying. And my dad was never anti-Semitic. He was very friendly to Jewish friends he had. And those were the only ones that I had ever seen. So Harry Truman, starting in the first grade, his teacher said, Harry just smiled his way through school. He was very attentive. Oftentimes when big games were going on outside, he'd be in there reading, and it's mentioned that he read, and it's probably true, every book in the Independence, Missouri library as a young man. And one of the most amazing things I saw was, I believe he was a sophomore or a junior in high school, and it was a tremendous high school. People look back at what he studied and how he did, and they said, this is the equivalent of many colleges today. And I say that because Harry Truman never graduated from college. And if he went at all, it was only for a few weeks to a kind of a local school where he was taking some classes. But he was an excellent student. And one of the papers that I read was just fantastic, because they were asked to do a study on Shylock, the money lender. And it would have been normal for Harry, it would have been normal for me and anybody else to write an analysis of Shylock and say, well, he's just was a kind of a money grubbing Jew and all that. And that's not at all what Truman wrote as a very young person. He said, I think I'd be the same way if I was treated the way Shylock was treated. And he defended him. And it was a beautiful paper. And I thought, wow, here is a young guy who could think for himself. And he wasn't influenced. I think that the fact that he had such access to this Orthodox Jewish family very young in his life, and he was not discouraged from that, really changed him. And I found this out with actually with all of the 5 presidents that I studied, that something happened in their young life, that a seed was planted, usually to make them amenable to liking the Jews or studying things that are Jewish. And that certainly happened with Truman. And but that seed didn't really sprout and flower until probably the time they were in their 60s, and in some cases in their 70s. So he graduated from high school in 1901, and Independence, Missouri in those days was on the frontier. It was the frontier of the United States. It was a rough, tough town, and there were gunfights and there were all kind of stuff. And Truman was growing up in this. And when he graduated from high school, he wanted to go to the to West Point, but because of his eyesight, he couldn't get in, and they just did not have the money for him to go to college. And so he had several jobs following high school, where he was a timekeeper for a railroad company, and then he was a clerk and a bookkeeper at different banks. And while he was working in those banks, there was a young Jewish boy that used to come in and bring the receipts from the shirt store where he worked. And his name was Eddie Jacobson. And Eddie Jacobson played a big role in Harry Truman's life, and in the fact that Harry recognized the state of Israel many years later. So they first got acquainted there while at that time. And then after 5 years, because his grandfather was maybe he died or he was not well enough to do it, his father, Harry Truman's father, insisted that his 2 sons come back to the farm and help him. Of course, they didn't want to lose the farm. So Harry went back to Grandview, and he farmed for, I believe, the next 11 years. And during that time, because he hadn't been able to go to West Point, he joined the National Guard and also the Masonic Order. And later he became, whatever it is, the 32nd degree Mason or something like that. Now let me move on here a little bit. While he was on the farm in 1917, World War I was going on. And even though Truman had been in the National Guard, after a few years, he kind of dropped out of it. And one of the reasons was he was so proud of his uniform. And when he came home, his grandmother, who had lived through the Civil War, the uniforms the National Guard were wearing looked exactly like the Yankees uniforms. And she just absolutely had a fit when he walked into the house. And so he made sure he never wore that uniform around there again. But when the war started and his grandmother had already died, he attempted to join his old unit. He was 33 years old, and he was older than the age limit for that time. But he was put into the 129th Field Artillery Regiment. And that the next thing they did before they were sent to France was they were sent down to Texas to learn how to shoot their artillery weapons. And while they were down there, it turned out that Eddie Jacobson, that Jewish boy who Harry had met 11 years before, turned out to be in Harry's unit. And Harry said to him, even though Harry now was a captain or lieutenant anyway, he made captain in France. He said to Eddie, you know what? Here's what we ought to do. Since we're here training, why don't we open up a little stand where we can sell coffee and pop and things like that. And any money we make, we'll buy baseball and football equipment for our unit. And he said, Eddie, I've got other responsibilities with this unit that I have now, and I want you to run the store for me. And we can read in Harry's letters back to his girlfriend, Bess, saying things that today people would say, oh, that's anti-Semitic, what he was saying. But it wasn't. It was a time when people talked that way. And he said, I've got this Jew who's just a crackerjack in my unit. And they did so well together that they made money for their unit, and all of his books, everything was absolutely clear. And when they arrived in France, along with Eddie, they were in the same unit now, and Harry was promoted to captain, and he was in charge of Battery D. And everybody that had Battery D was run out of the army because they were such an unruly group. And they were mostly all Catholic boys from Kansas City. They'd all gone to high school together and things like that. And they were just unruly. And Truman was not a big, loud guy by any means at that time. And he wrote, he said, well, I guess this is the end of my army career because this is Battery D and they're the worst ones. But you know, he won them over. And he was very frank and very honest and very tough. And he won their admiration. And this was a lifetime admiration that had happened to him. And these guys stuck with him the rest of his life. He and Eddie Jacobson were outstanding people in the war. They were very much involved in it, moving up to the front lines and all of those kind of things. And so when Truman came back from France, he and Eddie were demobilized, and Harry did not want to go back to more years of sitting behind the, the southern end of a couple of horses he's plowing with that were heading north. And he said, I don't need to go back to the farm. And Eddie said, well, you know what? I know the haberdashery business. I know shirts and ties and all that. I've been in that for years. Why don't we open a business together? And they did open a business together. It was called Truman and Jacobson. And it was downtown in Kansas City in one of the best locations right near the Muhlenbach Hotel. And people would come in there, and boys from the Battery D, who were almost all Kansas City boys, they were in there all the time, and they're buying a few ties and all the rest of that stuff. And they were doing okay. And then a kind of a mini economic decline came along, and they lost their business. And Harry and Eddie owed $20,000 to their creditors. This was an enormous amount. I mean, I wouldn't like to owe that to anybody today. And they refused to accept bankruptcy. And this really says something about them because they could have gotten out of it. And they insisted on paying back all the money that they owed. And quite honestly, it took them more than 15 years to clear the books and to pay everybody back. And this says a lot about those two. Usually when businesses fail like this, the partners oftentimes sue each other, and they say, you didn't pay the insurance, you didn't do the advertising, you didn't do all that stuff. That's not what happened to Harry and Eddie. They remained best friends. They even got closer during this period of time. And but Harry was married to Bess by this time, and Bess's mother owned the big house that Harry lived in. As a matter of fact, I think Harry never really owned a house till after they got out of the presidency. And Mrs. Wallace, who owned that house, had a rule: no Jew will ever be in this house. And she was extremely anti-Semitic. So here was Harry's best friend. And I think mostly when Harry was there, every week, Harry would leave the home, go over to Eddie's, have dinner with him, and then play cards and drink with his buddies. And they remained very close friends, even though they were now beginning to go their separate ways because the business was over. Um, Harry Truman ran for judge of the Eastern District of Jackson County. And Eddie went door to door selling shirts and ties, trying to make back that money. But they remained excellent friends for the rest of their lives, but certainly during all of that period of time. The way that Harry went from a failed businessman to running for judge of the county was because he had a fella in his unit in France, a guy that really loved him, and his name was Jim Pendergast. And Pendergast was the nephew of the big boss, the Democratic boss of Kansas City. And his name was Tom Pendergast, or Boss Pendergast. And Pendergast had all kinds of tricks up his sleeves. You can still see remnants of how he ran the county even today, because he would pave the rivers, and because he had connections to cement companies, so they'd put cement under all of the rivers and the streams and all this kind of stuff. And 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 Harry kind of knew these kind of things, but as a matter of fact, he was very honest in his dealings as a judge. He lost the second time he ran for judge. He was beaten, and then he jumped back into it again and won. And that was the only time he was ever defeated in a political uh, relationship. And then he jumped from being a county judge, and he wasn't a legal judge. He was kind of what we would call today a supervisor in the county. And but he was known for really running a straight operation. And he decided then he's going to run for Senate. And Pendergast didn't like that. Pendergast had somebody else he wanted to run, but he finally relented, and Truman ran for Senate, which is quite a leap. And in fact, he was elected. And this picture you might see at the bottom on the right hand corner is a picture of FDR's vice president. That's John Nance Garner, and he was from Uvalde, Texas. And all you Texans probably know the other famous people that came from Uvalde, including Matt McConaughey and Dale Evans, my singing partner. Anyway, this picture of Cactus Jack Nance is a good one because he pulled out, Truman went to meet him, and he pulled out this big 6-gun, which actually had belonged to Jesse James. And so this was a great picture. Now, Nance was the vice president to FDR. FDR had no use for vice presidents. It was only because the Constitution said you have a vice president. And so Garner went from being the Speaker of the House and having tremendous power in Washington to the vice presidency. And he was asked one time, how do you like being vice president? And he said, it ain't worth a bucket of warm spit. Although he didn't use the word spit, but they cleaned it up to put it in the newspaper. And I think perhaps some vice president is feeling that way today too. Anyway, this is John Nance Garner there with Truman. And Truman, when he got to the Senate, was the junior senator from Missouri, but he started building a reputation as being a guy who would investigate first the railways and interstate transport. And he found a lot of bad things that were going on, and he saved millions of dollars for the government. Then when World War II started, he was investigating the relationship between the military industrial complex, and he really found millions of dollars that was saved for the United States. And so his reputation as an honest investigator was really solidified. And it was when Truman first went to the Senate in 1934. By 1940, he was going to run again. And it was about this time that Tom Pendergast had been convicted of tax evasion and associated with voter fraud. And the other party tried to smear Truman with this. And they called him the senator from Pendergast. And everybody knew that Pendergast really was a big crook and all that kind of stuff. And Harry never sold him out. When Pendergast died, Harry Truman went to his funeral, even though everybody said, "Oh, don't go. You're really going to be smeared with this kind of stuff." He said, "I've loved this man and I'm not going to turn him down just because he's dead now." And so he survived that part of it as well. Now, something happened in October of 1943. And as you know, we were in the war from 1941. In 1943, there were, and I forget the number exactly, but I think it was like maybe 1,300. Don't write that in your Bible. I'm not exactly sure. But about 1,300 Orthodox Jews came mostly from New York, and they came to Washington, D.C. Look, the war's been going on since 41, but even prior to that, Hitler started the death camps and the concentration camps. These rabbis, most of them and their congregation, had come to the United States starting in the late 30s. And their families in their congregations would get letters from their families still back in Germany and in Poland. And it would say, the Germans are moving us for our own good, moving us to safety to the east. And we're going to be safe there and we'll write later. And then they never heard from them again. So these Jews understood there were terrible things going on in those camps. And they brought this information to Washington, D.C. And because they thought everybody worshiped FDR for the most part in the Jewish community for a lot of reasons. And so when they got to Washington, they came to have a meeting with FDR. They knew if they could just get to him, this is what they thought, if we could just get to him, that it would change everything because he doesn't understand what's really going on. And so these pictures show them gathering there in October of 43. By this time, perhaps, we don't know for sure, perhaps 2 million Jews had already died. But there was a chance to do something at that point to save the lives of what we know were more than 4 million Jews who were going to die in the next 2 years. And so they lined up, they marched to the White House, and when they got there, FDR had heard they were coming, and Jewish friends of his who had moved up in the government said, "You don't want to meet with them. Look at them. They've got these beards. They're an embarrassment." And so FDR decided he was not going to meet with them. He went out the back door and he said, "Find me something to do." And so there was I think a master sergeant in the Air Force who was retiring that day. So it was very important for him to go and meet with this master sergeant. And when they got there, they told these Jews, "Sorry, he's so busy, he just can't see you now, but give us a piece of paper and tell us what you want to do." This was very typical of what FDR did. Many Jews thought he was just the great savior, but when it really came down to being anti-Semitic, there's no question that he really was. Now, he got rid of John Nance Garner after 2 terms, and then he got a vice president named Wallace, Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace was really a wacko, very left wing and everything else. And most of the people in the Democratic Party, they said, "You can't run him again." Now, this was, Roosevelt was getting ready to run for his 4th term. And he said, "Okay, I don't really care about vice presidents anyway. Let's get rid of them. Who are we going to get?" Well, they went through everybody. And the only one finally they could come up with who didn't carry a lot of baggage with him was Harry Truman. Truman wanted nothing to do with this. Truman was absolutely opposed to being vice president. Anybody who had been close to FDR could see that he wasn't going to live probably another year. He was only in his early 60s. But anybody that saw him up close was just astonished by how sickly he was. And so actually, Truman wanted nothing to do with it. Truman said, I don't know anything about this kind of stuff. I don't want to be in there. And they had to find a way to trick him into it. And what they did was they were having their Democratic convention in Chicago. And Truman actually came there to nominate, I think it was Alvin Barkley, to be the vice president. And he had promised him. And some of the big wigs got with him and they said, no, you need to run for vice president. He said, I'm not going to break my word and I'm not going to do that. So they got him up in a hotel room and they'd already set this trick up with FDR. FDR didn't even come to the convention. He was out in California. And FDR had this idea that a telephone, unless you screamed into it, nobody could hear you. And so anybody that was ever on the line with Roosevelt had to hold the phone away from their ear or they would have lost their hearing. And so they got Truman in the smoke-filled hotel room with about 20 other people, and they made him sit on the edge of the bed, and they said, well, we're going to call the president now and see what he says. And the president immediately bellows out, have you convinced that guy from Missouri that he ought to be running for vice president? And the head of the Democratic Party said, no, sir, he's the orneriest mule I've ever run into. And then FDR went into his script and he said, will you just tell him if we're in the middle of a war, if we want to lose the war and he won't run for vice president, and if he wants to destroy the Democratic Party and all of these kind of things, he's just screaming that you just tell him I've had it, and he slammed the phone down. And Truman didn't know this was a trick. And Truman was very shaken by it. And he said, well, if I'd only known it was this important, I mean, I couldn't turn the president down. So in fact, he did. And he was at the convention. FDR never came to the convention. And so he was on the ticket as a vice president. And so he campaigned very vigorously for FDR. And then he was elected as vice president. And the next 82 days from the January 20th, which is coming up soon, that was 76 years ago this month, Truman only saw FDR one time. Truman had no idea the atomic bomb was being put together. He didn't know anything about the outcome or what the plan was for the war. He was left absolutely in the dark. And the only time he met with FDR invited him to the White House, and he thought, oh, I'm going to get a briefing on what's going on. Well, it turned out they met outside for breakfast, and the photographers were all there, and they took pictures, and then he was dismissed. So he didn't know anything that was going on. One of the things that, and because he was the vice president, he was also the president of the Senate, and so he would spend his days over there, sitting there with his old friends from the Senate, and then they would go to what was called the Board of Education after it was over. That's where they'd go down and they'd have something to drink and they'd tell stories with each other. And so that was what Truman was doing during these 82 days. But it was on February the 15th in 1945, Roosevelt had just come back from a meeting with Churchill and Stalin. And on his way back, he stopped to see the King Saud of Saudi Arabia. And he talked with him, and he said, after this war is over, we should let some Jews come into Israel or into Palestine. And Saud said, never is that going to happen. I will not allow a Jew to come into the Middle East. And Roosevelt said to him, I've learned more from you in 5 minutes than I've learned all these years from people briefing me on all of this kind of stuff. And what happened was Roosevelt went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, and he wrote a letter to King Saud on the 12th of April, confirming that no Jews were going to come in there unless Saud agreed to it. And so consequently, that letter was sent, and in a very short period of time, FDR was dead, and Truman was made the president of the United States. And I don't have that picture, but you can see some people behind Truman in this picture. These people were all of his staff, the staff of FDR, and they loved him, and they thought he was the greatest thing ever. And they had great disdain for Harry Truman. He was this farmer from Missouri. He knew nothing. He's probably got horse manure on his shoes and everything else. And it was a very difficult time for him, not only being sworn in, but during the next few months, it was extremely hard. They kept telling him what he could say and what he shouldn't say. And Truman was not a man that could easily accept that. So Truman had to step in as president. And during that time, during the next few months, it was amazing. He made the decision to drop the atomic bomb. He met again with Stalin and Churchill, and you can see Churchill's got a cigar, Stalin's got his cigarettes, and Truman was not somebody that smoked, so he was already kind of out of place there. But he had some early successes in bringing the war to a conclusion and bringing the United States into being. But in spite of those early successes, it was the start of the Cold War. Now, we only have a few minutes, but I want to get to probably the most important thing, and that was the start of the state of Israel. During all of this time, there was fighting going on. The British had pulled out, or were about to pull out, and Israel was debating whether or not they could become a country. And so most of the cabinet of Truman's was opposed to him recognizing the state of Israel. And Truman's, one of his own allies was a young man at that time named Clark Clifford. And Clifford was around Washington for the next 30, 40 years, a very influential person. But he was a very young man at that time. And Clark Clifford was very much for Israel becoming a state and the United States recognizing him. The leader who was opposed to it was the Secretary of State, George Marshall. Marshall had been the chief of staff of all the military. Eisenhower worked for him and everything else. He was the most admired man in the United States, and he was the most admired man by Harry Truman. When Marshall retired as general, Truman insisted that he come and be the Secretary of State. But Marshall was very much opposed for a variety of reasons, and I don't think any of them anti-Semitic on his part, to Israel being recognized by the president. He said, if we recognize them, we're going to have to go right back to war, all of these kind of things. And so Truman had arranged, almost without them knowing it, for a debate in his office. And Clark Clifford gave all the reasons why the United States should recognize Israel, and Marshall and his crew that was with him, they were adamantly opposed to it. And Marshall said, why is this young guy, Clifford, why is he doing here anyway? And Truman was kind of the referee. He said, because I'm the president of the United States and I asked him to be here. And that's when George Marshall really blew up, and he said something to the president that just shook Truman. He said, if I were to vote this year and you're running, I would not vote for you, Mr. President, if you do this. And that shook Truman to his core. And for years, I couldn't figure out, why did he say if I were to vote? You assumed he would vote. But then I found out in those years that Eisenhower, Marshall, and most of the leading military people never voted. They decided that they didn't want to mix politics with the military. And so Truman was accused of, you're just trying to play for the Jewish vote if you do this. Well, the truth was, when the vote came up, he didn't get the Jewish vote anyway. He didn't win New York. But what happened then was, Truman said, I'm washing my hands of the whole thing. It sounded like Pontius Pilate. And he said, I don't want to hear any more about it. I don't want anybody else coming in, neither Jews nor Arabs or anybody else trying to convince me. Turn it over to the UN. And basically put a sign up, I don't want to hear any more about it. But what was happening was, God was moving, and he was sending a man named Chaim Weizmann. And Chaim Weizmann was coming from Israel to meet, with the promise that he could meet with Truman for maybe 15 minutes. He got to New York. He was in a hospital bed, in a hotel, waiting for this opportunity to come down to Washington to meet with Truman, and Truman refused to meet with him. Truman had met him once before, and he realized this man was very persuasive, and he was not going to give him any openings. Now, this is where God really intervenes, and Eddie Jacobson was contacted by Jewish leaders who found out that he was a friend of the president's from World War I, and he had access to the White House that nobody else had. And they contacted him in Kansas City. They were collecting quarters and dimes at a meeting to get enough money to get on the phone, and they didn't really know what his name was. And so they were calling for Mr. Jacob Stein and Jake, all these different names. And finally they got hold of Eddie Jacobson, and they said, we know that you're a friend of the president. He said, listen to me. I have never asked the president for a favor, and I'm not going to do it now. And they said, listen, you're a Jew, and you better understand what's going on in Israel and how important this is. He said, well, I don't understand how important it is. And they said, get on a plane as soon as you can, come to New York, and we're going to brief you. He said, okay, I'll give you that. And so a lot of things happened. He wrote letters to Truman, and Truman said, there's nothing I can do about it. I just hope everything will work out. And someday when I see you, we'll tell you the truth. Well, in March, Eddie Jacobson walked unannounced into President Truman's office, in the Oval Office. And they started talking like good friends. Well, Harry said, hey, have the farmers gotten into their fields? I heard there was a lot of rain this year. Are they in there yet? And it was, how's your daughter? And how's your daughter? And all that kind of stuff. And it was Harry and Eddie. And then Harry was approached by Eddie, and he said, Mr. President. And immediately Truman got all tight, and he said, he realized this conversation was going somewhere else. And he said, don't start talking to me about the Jews. And he said some of the worst things possible. The reason I know what he said and what it was like is because I have a copy of Eddie Jacobson's handwritten notes from this meeting. There was no recording or anything else like that. But when I see these handwritten notes, it's almost like you feel like you're there. And he said he was so shaken up by the things Harry was swearing about that this was the worst anti-Semitic rant he had ever heard coming from Truman. And he thought, this is the end of our lifelong friendship. And then I saw it, and you can see in this picture, there's a red arrow going down to this man on horseback. And when I saw that, Eddie said, I walked over to it and I said, Harry, no more Mr. President. Harry, you've got a hero, and his name's Andrew Jackson. And you made this statue, which, by the way, you can go to Independence, Missouri, and it's still there. When he was the judge of the county, he had this statue built to Jackson. And then this was a little replica of it. He said, you probably know more about Andrew Jackson than any man in this country. And oh, by the way, when we had our shop together, you were always in the back room reading about Andrew Jackson. Well, I've got a hero too, and I've never met him, but his name is Chaim Weizmann. And Weizmann came all the way from Israel to meet with you for a few minutes. He's an old man. He's going blind. He's dying. And just because some rabbi had come in and slammed his hand down on your desk and said, you must do this, you are so hurt by that you refuse to hear Chaim Weizmann. He said, I know you're a better man than that, Harry. And Harry wheeled around in his chair and looked out the window. And Eddie said, I don't know how long this lasted, whether it was 5 minutes or it could have been an hour. But I'm looking at the back of his head and I thought, this is the end. We'll never have a friendship again. And then Harry Truman slowly turned around and looked at him. And he said, I heard the most enduring words that ever came from Harry Truman's lips. And he said, all right, you old bald-headed SOB, you win, I'll see him. And so in the next couple of days, they snuck Chaim Weizmann into the White House, and he convinced Harry Truman how important it was that Israel be recognized. And it was one of these things that God had planted those seeds years before, and it just took two Jews to convince him. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And on the 14th of May in Tel Aviv, and I know one of the ladies was saying how much it means to her when you go there to see where the Declaration of Independence was announced, that David Ben-Gurion came there. There was still an argument right up until a few minutes before he got there, what they were going to name this new state and whether they should name it or not. There was still some consternation about it. But the day before, they decided they're going to do it. And they only invited, and I forget the number of people, about 150 people. And they had messengers go to them and swore them to secrecy, that nobody could know what was going to happen. And the Jews all laugh about this. They said, you tell a Jew a secret, and by the afternoon, all of Israel knows it. And that's exactly what happened. Thousands showed up in front of this building and on the roof of the buildings nearby. And when David Ben-Gurion pulled up, he got out of his car, and there's a movie of this. And he looks around and he's startled, and he gives this salute. And then he's only 5 foot tall, and he tromps in. I mean, this was a very short man, but one of the strongest men in the world. And so he read the Declaration of the State of Israel. And when you go there, they still have a recording of it. The place was absolutely jammed. And the reason they chose this building was because it was mostly a cement block building. And if the enemy had known that all the leaders of Israel were there, they would have blown up that building. But they thought this would protect them a little bit. And so in 16 minutes, David Ben-Gurion made the translation. I mean, this is in English now. And there was arguments because some of those people were communists. Others were not Jewish believers at all. And they had to argue over whether they used the word God or Almighty Father or Hashem. And they finally settled on the Rock of Israel. And that's something in Psalm 19 that I try to always say before I go to speak somewhere. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable before thee, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So that's the word that was used in there. Ben-Gurion announced this, and then Truman waited until midnight in Washington, D.C. In Israel. And it was 6 p.m. in Washington, D.C. And 11 minutes later, he signed this wonderful document recognizing the state of Israel. We were the first nation in the world to do that, and it changed everything because Israel could now go on the open market and buy weapons to protect themselves. And you can see on this document that they didn't know what the name of it was. And they handed this to the president, and it said the new Jewish state. And somebody said, wait a minute, we just heard they're calling it Israel. And so Truman scratched it out in his own handwriting and wrote in the state of Israel. And it was approved the 14th of May, 6:11 p.m. In Washington time. It was 11 minutes after midnight in Israel. Isaiah 66:8 says, who's ever heard of such a thing? Has there ever seen things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. This was the fulfillment of prophecy. And usually I have a whole bunch of newspapers I'll show you, but basically the Palestine Post, which today is called the Jerusalem Post, has this great headline, "The State of Israel is Born." And it thrills me that God took a farmer out of Missouri and had planted these seeds in his heart. And when the time came, FDR never would have done this. And the other presidents that I write about, also the presidents ahead of them, never would have done the things they did. Believe me, Hillary never would have done what Trump has done in the last 4 years. Okay, I'm out of breath, and you're probably sick of hearing me. And in some ways, that kind of wraps up very quickly what Harry Truman did and how God worked in him and how God is still working. So that's it, Lori. I'm tired of hearing myself.
Well, thank you, John. What a wonderful presentation. I learned something. I actually learned lots of things in this presentation I did not know. So I want to open it up now. We've been together a little over an hour, so I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to open it up now for a short Q&A session. So if you have a question, please keep it brief, but do unmute yourself and ask away. And I guess in order to kind of make it somewhat orderly, maybe raise your hand so I can see, so we don't all unmute and start talking at one time. Hang on, let me see. Okay, I don't know if that works or not. Does anybody have any questions or comments to add to that? Yeah, no? Okay, if you want to unmute yourself, you can.
That's what I was trying to do.
Oh,
Unmute.
sorry. Okay.
Oh, I didn't have a question. I just wanted him to know, though, that I so thoroughly, I learned so much that I mean, there's some things I knew, but there is so much that I realized that I didn't. And then just all of the history of, from, the childhood portion forward was just, so intriguing. And I can't wait to get caught up by hearing session 1, which I'll do that, later. But I just wanted to thank him for taking the time to put this together for us.
You're welcome. Yeah, we definitely. I have a question, John. So, the whole idea here is looking at the presidents that you are highlighting in this book, these 5 presidents, and how they became blessers of Israel. Can you add any insight into, for those of us who may forgot or don't know or whatever, after he did that and he acknowledged Israel, at 6:11 p.m. in Washington, D.C. on May 14th, 1948, what happened in America for the rest of his presidency? Did that help us in any way? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'm not sure, but I know John Hagee was telling me the story of while he was sitting at the breakfast table with his father and they were listening to the radio. And he said, John, this is God's word being fulfilled. This is a prophecy being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. I regret that 1948, I was always reading the paper, but I was only reading the sports paper. And I was going through and watching, see how the Cleveland Indians were doing in the spring. And if my dad or mom had only said, look at the front page, and I do have a copy of that paper of Israel becoming a state. I wish that they had impressed that on me. I'd love to have that memory. Um, and I was very moved by John Hagee remembering this from his father pointing this out to him. Um, not too much was done by Truman after this. As a matter of fact, for he had refused to sell weapons to Israel. Israel was buying them now from Europe. So many of our arms were left behind in Europe when World War II was over. And prior to this, in order for Israel to get them in to protect themselves, they had to smuggle parts inside of tractors and different things like this. Well, now that they were recognized as a legitimate state, they could buy these kinds of things. And so they were able to protect themselves. They were attacked by at least 5 Arab armies the next day. And so it was a very dangerous time for them. And then there were some ceasefires, and then they'd start fighting again, and all this kind of stuff went on. By 1949, things kind of settled down. But this was when the West Bank was grabbed by the Jordanian army. And it also marked the demise of Great Britain, because Great Britain had really turned against the Jews. They were the greatest empire in the history of the world. Prior to this, they had turned against the Jews. They wouldn't allow Jews to come into Palestine when they were running it. And they armed these Arab armies while pulling out and hoping the Jews would probably be slaughtered, and then they would be begged to come back in. But of course, that never happened. And in a very short period of time, it was the end of the British Empire for having turned their backs on the Jews. And I think it was also the reason that Truman succeeded FDR at the time he did, because you can see when FDR had promised to the Arabs that not a Jew would be able to enter into Palestine. That was the final thing that, and FDR was only 63 when he died, which was kind of an amazing thing. So,
right. So what we've learned so far in the last presentation and this one, which was the foundation of everything that you're saying, which is nations, we've learned that nations rise and fall based on how they treat the land of Israel and the Jewish people. And that is based in scripture. And that's what you established last time we had you on. And so after Truman did this, then our country began to flourish, and Israel absolutely did as well. And so there's a common thread there, which is fascinating. So thank you, John.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, Harvey.
I have an easy one for you, John. When you mentioned the Cleveland Indians and you earlier referred to selling pop, I'm assuming you're from the Midwest.
Yeah, originally from Ohio.
There you go.
Yeah.
Nice to meet a fellow Buckeye.
Okay, you can't see it probably, but I'm wearing my Ohio State hood, and if I took it off, I have an Ohio State jersey under it.
When we moved to Texas, we were sitting out in an apartment and they were talking about the big game between Texas and OU. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Did you know OU was playing?" And all these people said, "You went to OU?" We said, "Yes, the other one, Ohio University."
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, great. Nice. Nice to talk to you.
Likewise.
Okay, guys, please ask away. Any other questions or comments for John? Unmute yourself if you're trying to say something.
Well, this is Peter. I was just wondering why it was that Britain abandoned the Jews. I mean, they got control of Palestine, I guess, after the Balfour Declaration in the 20s. And they got what was called, I think, a protectorate over Palestine. But what do you know why Britain abandoned the Jews?
Well, one thing I'd say very quickly, and it's actually, I wrote another book called The Rise and Fall of the British Empire, and it's about that very thing.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons is that even though Balfour and about 8 other men that were high up in the British government had a biblical background, and they understood the importance of perhaps helping the Jews to go back to Israel, and that's why the Balfour Declaration came out. But most of the people certainly in the British government that were in Palestine at that time, they were opposed to that whole thing, and they dragged their feet wherever they could, and the army was not overall very helpful to the Jews. They sided with the Arabs quite often, and it wasn't very long before Churchill and some others kind of changed. You know, they're kind of rhinos, changed their position on the state of Israel. And then when you got into Bevan and some of these other people, they were very anti-Semitic. And there's certainly a lot of that going on in England today. And it really hasn't changed much. And as Europe has lost so much of its Christian background, so has England. And they're not stalwart in supporting Israel today. As a matter of fact, one thing Hitler did, which most people don't know about, he made an offer to Great Britain that if they would take all these Jews out of Germany, he would give them to him. And they could do, and Great Britain refused to do that. So it was not being a blessing to Israel that I believe really caused the demise of Great Britain. And today they're called the UK, and they're having a hard time just getting out of the European Union. And that's certainly the one thing that I don't want to see. I don't want to see the United States weakening in our support of Israel by any means. We've just gone through 4 years where we've never had a president who has been such a blessing to Israel. And and I think God gave, I don't want to get into the politics of this, but I'll say this last thing. I believe God gave our nation a reprieve. We had 4 years when it comes to blessing Israel, a reprieve that I don't think anyone thought was going to happen with President Trump. And so anyway, we believers need to be speaking up, and we need to stand for these kind of things, because it's the future of our nation and the future of our children and grandchildren for these kinds of very things that Truman was the start of it. And praise God, I'm so thankful that he had his heart strengthened, and he had his heart turned around. And there were a couple of Jews, Weissman and Eddie Jacobson, who were able to change that. One quick thing, when I was last at the President's Truman's home in Independence, Missouri, it was a very cold day, and the only guy there was a guide. And I'd been there before, and so we were talking in the kitchen. And in the kitchen, there's a linoleum, and there's a big section of it that's just nailed down, because when Truman left the White House, there was not any money for him. There wasn't a pension or anything like that. And he and Bess drove from Washington, D.C. to their home in Independence. And when they put the linoleum down, they didn't have the money for the glue, the tar. And so they just laid it. And then part of it peeled up and cracked, and then he nailed it down. And but Bess continued the same thing that her mother had, that no Jews were ever allowed in that house. And this was about 1954, 55. There were some Israelis who happened to be in Kansas City, and they said, why don't we try to call the president and just say hello to him? And they called, and it was a Sunday morning. And he said, I'll tell you what, Bess is at church. If you can get over here right away, I want to meet with you. So they came in and they sat in that kitchen. It was the only time, Bess never knew about it, that Jews had been allowed in that house. And so I'm sure that guide now is telling that story.
John,
Okay.
can I interject something?
Yeah.
One of the individuals on tonight said they were intrigued by the kibbutz. There happens to be a kibbutz in Rehovot outside of Tel Aviv called the Elon Institute. And on this kibbutz, this was pre-48, before the state was formed. It was a dairy co-op, and they also had a bakery. And,
Yeah.
you may be familiar with this.
Oh,
It was an
yeah.
underground munitions facility where they were smuggling in the casings for the bullets in the bottom of milk containers. And at the other end was the bakery oven, which was on wheels. And all of this was about 20 feet below ground. So it was a production facility to manufacture and test the bullets. A lot of the people that worked in that suffered because they weren't out in sunlight. And the story that we heard when we were there, it was so secretive that families did not know that their spouses were involved in this manufacture and testing of the bullets. And there was a woman that accused her husband of having an affair. Nothing was ever said until about it was, I think, in the 70s, that they opened this up as a museum for people to see. And she realized at that point in time, after the fact that they got divorced, what the sacrifice was for the country, that he did not have an affair, but he was working in that facility. And that was the commitment of the people for the land and the state and the birth of Israel as well. It's a very interesting story. If you have the opportunity to go to Israel, this is one of many sites that I would encourage you to go see, because it's open to the public. You can actually see the facility. They have original there, and it's very interesting.
Yes. John, I believe you take your groups there, yes?
Oh, yeah, we do. And after they realized that these people who were working underground all the time didn't have a suntan, they actually got sun lamps. And they had a little booth that they all had to sit in and get sunburned. No, it's an amazing kind of thing, and it shows. And all this had to be done underground because the British were checking all the time. And so anyway, one of the things they did, which was clever, was the British would come and they'd give them beer, and it was warm. And they said, if you'd call us about a half an hour before you're coming, we can put it on ice. And so they started calling, and that way they could shut down the bullet factory underneath so there was no noise. And so the British would get their cold beer, and they never discovered this underground bullet factory.
That's so typical. So many fascinating stories of Israel. That's why when you go, it's just one trip is usually like an overview, and then you have to go back and learn more. There's so much. John, I think we're good unless anybody has a question or comment. I don't want to, I want to give you the opportunity to please jump in, but if there are no more questions, please conclude with telling us about how people can get in contact with you, how they can order your books, how they can connect with you when you start doing tours again. Can you share that information?
Yeah, we have booked tours, but it's all not for sure. I mean, you never know. And the only reason that's holding us up is the COVID stuff. Israel is leading the world in getting people vaccinated, but they're going into a lockdown again on Thursday, or that's today, I guess. Anyway, so that's kind of up in the air. We are planning, if we can, going to go back in May, also in August, and also in November. The book about the presidents, if you'd like a copy, I can get it to you cheaper than if you buy it online. And my email address is easy to remember. It's Israel, and then the numeral 4, Somerville, which is Somerville, Israel 4 Somerville @gmail.com. Just send me an email, and I'll send you a copy. And so I'd be very glad to do that. Anyway, I appreciate this opportunity, and I really look forward to seeing you next week. And we have another president who's warming up right now in the bullpen.
Yep.
And he'll be ready to come in.
Yep. Okay, great. All right, so I don't think y'all know this. I don't think it was set in the email, but we are going to be having John back, let's see, every Thursday in the month of January. Originally, it was just going to be 3 nights, but it's going to be 4 nights total. So this is one of 4 presentations he's doing this month. So we have 3 more to go. So mark your calendar. And again, we will be having other speakers that come in and do presentations. We hope to be scheduling more into the new year. John, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you everybody for coming and joining us. I will be sending out this recording in an email, so keep your eye on your inbox, and we wish everybody a happy new year and stay safe, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night,
Laura.
everybody.
Seeing everyone.
Thanks, John. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.